I think sometimes we look for, what's the policy recommendation? What's the path? What I'm trying to identify are what are the key issues that we need to contend with? What are the shared definitions that we can agree upon so that we can identify how we start to take steps forward together, even if the path that we're on might be, parallel to one another or heading off in slightly different directions. But with this end goal in mind that that we have to figure out how to still power our economies on a day-to-day basis and ensure that regions are thriving.
Well, welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast. And today I am very pleased to have as my guest Abby Smith, who is President and CEO of Team PA. And we met recently, actually, just a month or two ago at an event in Pittsburgh. And Abby's role is to lead Team Pennsylvania's work, which is a neutral convener, bringing together public-private entities to address all kinds of long-term issues, of which energy transition and decarbonization is one. I did notice on your bio, Abby, that earlier this year, you received the Above and Beyond Award, which honors Pennsylvanian women of public and civic mind who have demonstrated exemplary leadership. So that's an amazing recognition. So congratulations on that. And welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the congratulations. And of course, for having me.
So we'll kick off with the normal starting point, which is I always ask my guests this. It's about how you've arrived at this point in time. And the reason I always ask is because we're still at a stage with energy transition and decarbonization work where people are bringing all sorts of backgrounds to this really complex and long-term issue. So yes, let's hear a little about you. What are the personal and professional drivers that mean that you're here with me today talking about energy transition?
Sure. I am not sure that I can give you a really neat and clean career trajectory, career path, and especially because I really did not expect to be the president and CEO of Team Pennsylvania, or we call it Team PA for short. I started out as a teacher. I very quickly found myself thinking about, what are the different things that get in motion, the long game of telephone that gets played, in our case, in Washington, D.C., all the way down to my classroom. I was a teacher when No Child Left Behind was passed. And I had an administration where when I would ask a question about kind of a new thing that we were supposed to do, they would say, well, No Child Left Behind. So that's why we have to do that thing. And I became really interested in what are the decisions that are made at different levels that ultimately affect, at the most localized level in the four walls of my classroom. And so I loved teaching. I loved my students. I loved the families I was working with. But I think that I realized I was a systems level thinker. And I kind of came to a policy path. And I always thought I'd be this policy expert. But I have to say that it was in education, and energy never crossed my mind as an area outside of just thinking about the education systems and workforce development related issues that certainly connect to energy and to energy transition. But that was my background, my area of expertise. And as these things often do, I just found myself one day in the right place at the right time where the organization was going through a bit of a transition. And I was, called upon to step up in what started as an interim capacity and then shifted to, threw my hat in the ring to get the full-time job. One of the first conversations that I had actually when I was the interim was specifically around energy transition. There was somebody who's working at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He's a public servant. And I had a great conversation with him where, I was taking over for the previous CEO's calendar. And he said, there's a role for Team PA to play in this conversation. So let me give you a little bit of background. Let me give you a little bit of information. And here's why the public sector can't lead this alone. And here's why the private sector can't lead this alone. A lot of light bulbs went off for me. And while we work in a lot of other areas, energy transition and decarbonization is just a perfect space for public and private sectors to work together. So that's a little bit about kind of how I got here.
So the little bit before you and I met, the little bit that I knew of Team PA was that you sit kind of at the heart of this conversation in Pennsylvania, which many states have a similar conversation going on, which is really to do with how you go from the kind of existing industrial landscape, the existing, in your case, a lot of oil and gas, and energy production. How do you take a state that's so rooted in that, but also build opportunities in carbon management and, through the energy transition? But can you just give us a little background? Because obviously people listening into this from all over the world who won't know what Team PA does, but how did it start? And then how has it come into this convener role, within energy transition and decarb?
Sure. Team PA has been around for, little over 27 years. So we're a public-private partnership. And I think, people often hear that P3 term. But when we were founded, it was with this idea that the best things that government can do really need the input from the drivers of our economy, the business sector, and that the best things that business can do cannot be done without working hand in hand with government. And so at the heart of our organization, we are thinking about the ways in which the public and private sectors can come together, can do work that would be greater than they could do alone. And so this requires a deep respect of both entities and what perspectives and work and the expertise, the role that they play. So even when we're interviewing somebody for a job at Team PA, we need them to have really positive feelings about government and what's possible. And we need them to have really positive feelings about business and what's possible. And I'm sure that we can all think of people in our lives who have a certain amount of negativity in both of those spaces. But it is, in many ways, the art of the possible. It's thinking about the opportunities as opposed to being focused on the problems. And Pennsylvania itself, where our moniker, if you're not aware, is the Keystone State. And, you think of a keystone within infrastructure and a bridge, that role that a keystone plays as an intersection point. I really think about how Team PA in many ways operates as a bit of a keystone. We get to kind of be at the middle of, the center of where the drivers of our economy ultimately sit, which is going to be how the public sector shows up, how the private sector shows up. And our role is to be a thoughtful partner and a long-term steward of the economic health of Pennsylvania's economy. When it comes to energy transition, and how we kind of landed in this spot, we have had a lot of projects and work over the years that I would say are, created a foundation for this work. And this is just because Pennsylvania is the #2 energy state, no matter how you slice it. So across the country, we are a producer to other states. We have a big energy footprint, and we also have a big industrial sector footprint. When you look at the founding of Pennsylvania and you look at where energy fits in, this is the home of advanced nuclear. This is the birthplace of, where many different energy transitions have happened with coal and oil and gas. This is a place that makes a lot of sense to be now at the center of yet another energy transition, and figuring out how do we power the activities that all of us do that require a lot of energy around us to make our lives work, and also ensure that we are being thoughtful stewards of the environment. And as we think about how to achieve decarbonization goals that we've set, we have a deep belief that the big industrial producers out there therefore have to be a key part of the solution. Right now, you could easily frame it as, they're part of the problem. They have to be part of the solution. So I think that's the role that Team PA plays ultimately.
I just want to take this opportunity to thank our production partner and sponsor, Jano Media, for their support in delivering the Decarb Connect podcast. Over the last few years, they've helped us to facilitate great conversations that connect us with our audience, and their skills and expertise mean that we get to concentrate exclusively on generating the content, the conversations that engage, inform, and inspire. Okay, so let's just sort of go down into the next level under that then. So could you, whether it's a kind of a meeting you've held recently or a project you've been the convener around recently, can you just give a sense of who came to the table, just so we can picture that? Like, who are you bringing together, and what was it that Team PA was doing, just to really give that clarity?
Sure. I have a good example, and it also just highlights just how we work. So we host what's called a cross-sector collaborative. It's our Energy Horizons cross-sector collaborative. Across this table, we're talking about a network of hundreds of individuals and organizations. And this is everything from businesses that are really large and ones that we've all heard of to little startups that have yet to really get their foothold. This includes government partners at the highest levels of government, not just in the state, but also local and regional partners. And we have federal public sector partners also that are represented in our work. We have nonprofits and academic organizations and academic institutions you've heard of, and tiny little community colleges that are key providers of our workforce in our energy major energy state. So we bring all these people together. In many ways, I say, Team PA sets the table, and then we really expect the experts around it to set the agenda. So when I think about an example of just how we work, and I think I have kind of a perfect one to share, we asked what's next. We saw that the federal government was putting out a ton of dollars around carbon capture and storage, and then also around hydrogen. And we wanted to make sure that Pennsylvania shows up in the mix. As I said, we're the #2 energy state. How do we make sure that Pennsylvania really shows up on the map? So in convening the group and talking about what are the priorities and doing the kinds of things you would do with strategic planning and ultimately implementation, how do you start to get this work forward? A number of people said, I don't know that we need another study, but man, we could really use a roadmap for how we get this work done. How do we actually start to do this in Pennsylvania? So this was back in the beginning of 2022. So first, there were a couple of government partners actually who said, yeah, that's the kind of thing the government can issue. We can do a roadmap here. And in some quiet conversations, I said, how long would it take you to issue an RFP to do that work? And they said, well, it'll probably take many months. And so here we know the federal government's coming out with these dollars. And that also we have a lot of motivated stakeholders around the table who want to see this work happen. This is the kind of thing where, Team PA can also be a bit of a nimble, quick moving partner. So the other thing is that when it comes out of a government partner, it has a bit of the flavor of whichever politician happens to be holding office, right? And so I think it's important that a roadmap then is not stuck in a particular political lane, right? And it also then has a lane when it's coming out of a nonprofit organization that maybe is looking to advocate for a particular position. The fact that we can be this very neutral, nonpartisan broker meant that not only could we very quickly put out an RFP, but we could put out one that really reflected this larger group. So how these things often go is like a staff person will type something up and then we send it out and that kind of thing. In this case, we did type up a bit of a straw person, but then we had a small group that raised their hands and say, I'd like to work on this. And there are decision makers across all the different types of organizations I recommended. They put in so many track changes and edits, and they went back to their own companies and they had 35 people look at things. And what we ended up with was a really, I think, much better work product than we would have done if we had just kind of done it ourselves or had just a couple of thought partners in there. And we put on an RFP that reflected the work product of that broader group and represented a lot of different voices. We then had the work group actually identify, which proposal we should select. The group we were going to work with ultimately was the Great Plains Institute. They put together a proposal that really met our needs. And then that working group continued to work with the GPI team on the actual work product. So then by the time we got to September of 2022, and the federal government was just starting to roll out some of these huge initiatives and funding opportunities, suddenly you see Pennsylvania starting to show up on the map, that we've released this roadmap for how to actually move forward with carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, how we actually take advantage of this moment in Pennsylvania. But then we have a group of stakeholders who have so much more buy-in into not just the work product, but then wanting to actually see the roadmap come to fruition. And so it's a good example of, perhaps a little bit of a messier project and process. But I think the end result is something that while Team PA's name is ultimately stamped on it, there's a lot of people who can claim wins through that, who can say this is a work product that I was part of. And we presented that as actually the only state that presented at the Global Clean Energy Action Forum in September 2022, which was held in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So excited to be able to share a work product that's very much greater than the sum of its parts.
One of the things that struck me both when we met in September, but also when we were talking the other day in our prep call, is how comfortable you are at convening voices, some of which will meet in the middle ground relatively easily, but also voices that are on kind of more extreme or polar opposite sides of energy transition. And, you know, Pennsylvania, even this English girl knows that Pennsylvania is rooted in coal as well as oil and gas. And I'm sure that brings with it a lot of, residual assumptions, a lot of residual feelings about where the state is at the moment. Oh, now we've got the energy transition. I'm sure you've got voices on both sides of that who are pretty strident, right? So how do you go about getting those people to the same table and bringing something out of their thoughts and feelings that can actually be combined? Because it feels like whatever is happening in what you're doing there could be valuable for so many of the discussions that listeners are having in all sorts of contexts around energy transition. So how do you do that?
I think it comes from a deep belief that the people who are working on the issues that they're working on, sometimes same topic, but coming at it from very different places, to your point, that they actually ultimately probably want the same thing for their community. They want to have their communities thrive. They have different thoughts about how you get there. So I think that there is inherent to not just kind of how the organization works, but all of the people who are on Team PA staff. We have a tremendous amount of not just optimism and positivity, but I would say we believe in the power of collaboration and people. And we think that the work is better as a result of having lots of different voices around the table. I will say that there are people on the fringes of conversations who do not want to work with us. They do not want to pull up a chair at a table as a staunch environmentalist and working with a coal company. And so while I certainly am not going to, spend all of my time trying to convince them, I can certainly keep the door open to their participation. So I don't want to suggest as if, everybody is kind of happily sitting at a table together. That's certainly, that's certainly not the case. But I do think that for those, I'll use that exact example, for those environmentalists who actually want to figure out how to work with a coal company, sometimes it can be incredibly hard to figure out what table to sit at with them. That's a very challenging thing, and vice versa, that it can be really hard for a coal company to figure out how do I sit down with environmentalists. Even something as simple as just talking about decarbonization, it's eliminating the very product of the carbon, right? So it's a really, I think, recognizing how fraught it is, and that there are so few forums that allow for dialogue back and forth and for collaboration, with a deep belief that then the work that is done in partnership has the potential to really move the needle. It may not also be what a coal company could say publicly, and it may not be what an environmentalist can say publicly, but perhaps the work that they do together can be grounded in where those common goals lie. And so the way that I think of it as a visual, and it's part of the reason we talk about this Energy Horizons cross-sector collaborative, is on the horizon is an energy future that I think many of us actually share a common vision for. The road that we get there can actually be a pretty wide path that allows for a lot of different voices and approaches, and I think actually requires a lot of different voices and approaches, because I don't think that it's going to be a straight one. It's going to be awfully circuitous. It's going to require, if you picture that river all the way to the horizon, along that path, you're going to talk a lot about, tributaries and twists and turns. And I think that that's what those different varied voices allow for. We also see that the work sometimes resonates more with others and at other points in time than it does, at some later points. And I think allowing for that flexibility for our network to be dynamic means that people can come in and out of the work but that ultimately we have to figure out how to work together to play the long game. In the short term, we might find some real differences. And so people might step away and then come back to it. But for me, the goal is not seeking consensus. The goal is to continue to have a shared table because we actually ultimately have shared goals for the future.
Yeah, so I suppose at first listening to that, you're like, their job is to find compromise between these folks. But actually, no, the goal is the end. The goal is that end horizon. And if in the interim people are on different routes, what you're saying is that's fine because we're still going towards the same place.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think sometimes we look for, what's the policy recommendation? What's the path? What I'm trying to identify are what are the key issues that we need to contend with? What are the shared definitions that we can agree upon so that we can identify how we start to take steps forward together, even if the path that we're on might be, parallel to one another or heading off in slightly different directions. But with this end goal in mind that that we have to figure out how to still power our economies on a day-to-day basis and ensure that regions are thriving. And we ultimately want to make sure that we're responsible for the water that we drink, the air that we breathe, right? So we share those goals. And so I fundamentally believe that we have to work on these things together rather than try to pick one another apart. And by the way, a lot of that is happening anyway in other spaces. And so I'll leave that to other folks to kind of duke it out in other places. The table that we're setting is one where we value the voices of all of those that are pulling up a chair.
Yeah, interesting. And interesting, particularly, I know many states and countries have felt themselves to be on the sharp and pointy end of kind of the last 2 decades of global transition, but nowhere more, I would imagine, than Pennsylvania. It probably hasn't always felt like it's been the winner in globalization and that trend. So positioning all those parties at the table with that same view of this is about our community, our state, about Pennsylvania, being on the right side of this next transition is quite a powerful clarion call, isn't it? I suppose, and that must keep bringing people back to the table, even when they're secretly going, "Where I order,"
Yeah, and by the way, I think it's a little harder to hate up close. So I think that as people are kind of sitting, shoulder to shoulder, and they come to see each other's work sites in action, or they come to look at the work that's being done. This is where you actually start to find common ground, where you start to find common opportunity. And I can give another example. We do these deep dive series where we take a topic that's just hard, hard to understand, hard to pick apart, hard to work with. One of those is like poor space and liability. And so we kind of say, okay, if we need to understand the space between the rocks, what's there, who owns what, these are hard topics. So at the very least, let's get a number of different experts from different perspectives, different information, and let's just put that forward to provide more information and do a bit of a level setting. We invite legislators to listen in. And it's not about educating on one particular perspective or another. It's like just basic educating. Let's do the 101. What are we really talking about here? And what are the different challenging issues that have to be decided without saying this is the right way? We can actually do quite a bit of trying to pick apart and understand, well, what are the issues? What are the different perspectives and why do they exist? And if we don't contend with those, what's going to happen? We're going to get left behind, or we're going to make some decisions that maybe haven't been made thoughtfully and with full information in hand. So I think that our role, it's not just about educating one where we're just providing information that you can kind of search on YouTube and just, find, what do these things stand for and things like that. It's saying, let's bring together some very different perspectives. Let's give people a safe space to ask questions among experts. And let's then allow the space for those differing viewpoints, or just even finding where the common ground is. Let's give people the space to actually speak those out, hear one another, And it's not then that we're trying to kind of change minds in any particular direction. I think we want to make sure that our policymakers, our business leaders, our labor organizations, our nonprofit institutions, our academic institutions, that all of them are let's at least start with, identifying the key issues we need to collectively contend with. That's an awfully good place to start.
Yeah, I guess, it's certainly conversations in the UK and the US that I've had always remind me that whether you're, a senior business leader, a senior industrial leader, or a senior leader in state or federal government or UK government, or wherever you are, one of our biggest challenges around very complex things like energy transition is to get people to step away from an automatic poll, like my automatic position, because I once read a tweet on this, is X, because they're dealing with huge amounts of information all the time. They're working at speed. They're never going to become an expert, but they need to be enough of an expert to be able to form an opinion that isn't just based on, that random headline they once saw or something like that. So yeah, really valuable work. So for Team PA itself, then, what is the goal? Like, how do you set a goal as a neutral convener? What is it that you want to achieve this year versus in, I don't know, 5 years? How do you assess that?
For us, we're we're in a growth mode as an organization, broadly speaking. And so we passed a strategic plan in the summer of 2022. Our board of directors, by the way, our 49-person board of directors, which is co-chaired by the governor of Pennsylvania. And the other co-chair is a private sector CEO of a Pennsylvania-based company. Together we're not just doing work in public-private partnership. Our board is a public-private partnership, right? And so we sat down and did the process that I think many people are familiar with, of what goes into reimagining yourself or imagining what's next as an organization. So we have a clear sense of that, which is in part that we want to continue to be the long-term stewards of Pennsylvania's economic health. But the way in which we do that, we wanted to better articulate our theory of change. So I've talked a lot about the strategic collaboration part of that. But coupling strategic collaboration with strategic investment, knowing that the ideas that are incubated together then need to be activated. And we believe that that is how we can achieve our mission of accelerating economic growth through public-private partnership. And that requires us to continue to be a convener, to be known as a convener, to bring together public and private partners on these challenging topics. So in addition to what we've been talking about around industrial sector decarbonization, around energy and energy transition, we also have other goals and other areas in which we work: agriculture, manufacturing, life sciences, innovation and technology. These are all areas where we think that the potential for economic growth and opportunity relies heavily then on what partners are brought to the table and what ideas are unlocked through public-private partnership, and also, as I said, through strategic investment. So as an organization, we are looking to grow the partners that we work with, policymakers and business leaders being kind of key among them, but other partners as well. And then in addition to that, growing our footprint as an organization, making sure that we have the dollars to work with to make those big strategic investments, those big swings. This is actually a big state. We are large in terms of population and footprint. As I mentioned, we're an energy producer of a state. And so we think that that merits having dollars that can then spur and accelerate economic growth in ways that they couldn't otherwise. And when we think about the potential of dollars coming out of, whether it's private sector, public sector dollars, we also think in the same way that there's power in doing work together, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, so too is there power in investments that happen, where the public and private dollars that can get leveraged and braided in very different ways through a neutral convener can also accelerate economic growth and make some huge swings. So as an organization, we're looking in that direction, that if there is a big opportunity in Pennsylvania's economy, that Team PA is at the center of that we are pulling together the necessary partners to realize those opportunities. And not every issue is a state level issue. Not every issue requires public-private partnership, but the ones that do, we want to be a key driver of that. And we want to make sure that we're setting that table, but also then spurring the work that's done together through strategic investment. So that's kind of where we're headed. And then the different issues I mentioned, the way in which the interplay happens between those different areas. So we know that there's a big connection between what happens in manufacturing, what happens in energy. We know that in life sciences, there's deep needs in the agriculture sector. And we think that a lot of Pennsylvania's strengths are also going to be best leveraged by how the interplay happens, a bit of a flywheel effect, so to speak. And so with our work, it's about not just implementing, a strategic plan. It's really making it so that our policymakers and business leaders can see themselves in Pennsylvania's economic future.
So we've talked a bit about the stakeholder groups that you bring together, specifically on decarbonization. So within that, all those strands of work that you are pushing forward, specifically on decarbonization, what are some of the unique to Pennsylvania issues that you're focused on?
The unique to Pennsylvania issues, I think that for us, where Pennsylvania can lead on energy transition and decarbonization, I think looks a little bit different than some of the states that are in this area. We think there's a lot of opportunity around hydrogen. Hydrogen doesn't generate direct emissions or pollutants or greenhouse gases at its point of use. And so we see this as really critical to Pennsylvania's economy because we can direct emissions using hydrogen as a feedstock. So when we think about trucking and steel and chemicals manufacturing and industrial heat, all of those different components, we think that hydrogen is going to be a crucial path for us given our industrial strength. And then I think that starts, the market liftoff happens in this case with blue hydrogen, with the feedstock being natural gas and with carbon capture storage technology built into that. And the reason is that Pennsylvania sits on the Marcellus Shale. We have a very robust natural gas industry. While it starts with natural gas, we think that there's ample opportunity to see hydrogen that's blended ultimately with sources that are derived from renewables, from green hydrogen. We think that there's opportunities when it comes to pink hydrogen, things that are connected to advanced nuclear. And to that end, we actually have just started a whole separate work stream within our energy collaborative looking at nuclear technology. We think that especially given manufacturing base in Pennsylvania, that the way that small modular reactors could potentially take off here creates a tremendous amount of economic opportunity while also a real path for decarbonization. And then, as I mentioned with carbon capture, we think that this is something where we can really address these very difficult to decarbonize industries, and that adding CCUS into the mix means that we can continue a path forward for our major industrial drivers of Pennsylvania's economy, while really mitigating some of the environmental damages that come with that. So that's kind of what's on tap next for us.
Okay. All right. Well, just as we're sort of starting to think of closing out on this, let me ask you two last questions. So first is, when you think about the way that you and your team work, and you've really articulated that well, how is this different from how other states or countries are kind of bringing people together, do you think? What's your sense of what your secret sauce is, if you like?
I would love to see a parallel entity like ours in other states. I'm not sure that we have one. I mean, I certainly have kind of looked high and low. I think that there's a lot of issues where you need a neutral broker and convener, and also somebody who's going to play the long game. I think business markets, they kind of rise and fall, and there's certainly an ebb and flow to political tides. I think it's important to have a partner that continues to take the long view and play the long game, because it's one where I think in a day-to-day, we're often motivated on what's kind of right in front of us. So when we look at other states and other opportunities that exist within those states, oftentimes, there are many partners that are kind of in, I think, a tough cycle of having to figure out exactly, what's next day to day. And we've demonstrated that we can be this very action-oriented organization that still systems change, a long-term systems change organization. There's not always an inherent business model in that, where, we're raising funds to be able to support that work on a regular basis that are coming from public and mainly private sources. But I think that what we've landed on is a model that works well for people who believe in the power of collaboration. And also, as I kind of started with, believe in the power of the private sector and the public sector and what they can really accomplish together. So I don't know that there is a parallel entity in another state. But I think that we've really landed on a secret sauce here, and we'll continue to kind of forge a path forward within Pennsylvania, with the hopes that, many of our peer states are doing the same in a different forum, different venue.
And then last question for you, when you think about all those different stakeholders, all those different positions that people come from, what would be your kind of call to action, whether it's for kind of business and government leaders in your state or more widely, what's the kind of call to action you want to leave people with?
I think that energy transition is really hard, and actually working collaboratively is really hard. These things are hard. But where I feel like the opportunity and, for the best success will exist, is bold action. I think that sometimes with a lot of this work, it's hard to be a first mover. It's hard to figure out how to be a first mover. It's hard to make that financially viable. And I'm really thoughtful about that when I talk to businesses about, what is it going to take to decarbonize steel? Well, you can't drive away your customer base by pricing yourself out of the market, right? And when I think about government and the role that they can play, you certainly can't drive away your constituencies, whatever side of the aisle you're on. You have to pass policies that are going to meet the needs of communities. These are all really hard, challenging topics and decision points, but I don't think that there's ever going to be a super clear, straightforward, narrow path. There is always, though, going to be challenging decisions. And I think at a certain point, what I would ask of partners, particularly of leaders who sit at the seat, who sit in the seat where they can actually make the decisions, is that this is going to require bold leadership. And part of that bold leadership, I think, is also, bold collaboration. And so I really do hope that, not just as we kind of sit in our seat and sometimes become a bit of a lightning rod for these challenging issues, I hope that we are flanked by many others who are standing with us in partnership to be bold in the work that they do, because I think it's going to take a lot of courage. But I actually think that that's, quite frankly, the only path forward.
Abby, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you. I really enjoyed meeting you at the event in Pittsburgh. And by the way, I loved Pittsburgh. I think I told you this on site, that within about, 6 hours of being in the city, I'd plotted where our new office would be. I've had to rein myself back in, but I really loved my time there, and I enjoyed meeting you very much. Thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I feel the same way. Enjoyed meeting you, and certainly am glad that we got to pick up the conversation here. Really appreciate you having me on.
At Jano Media, we recognise that great content has the power to create impactful and positive change for lives and society. Whether that's video, live streams, photography or podcasts, partnering with us will enable you to harness the power of content to engage, inform, and inspire. Reach out to us today.